This is Nickolay Miklouho-Maclay Jr. He's on his way to the remote Rai Coast in Papua New Guinea. Nickolay is a direct descendant of the famous Russian scientist and explorer of the same name, who first came here over 150 years ago. Nickolay studied life here, and in 1877 he left with 16 human skulls, taken with consent according to his records.
Hello, my brothers! I'm really happy I'm here.
The Russian explorer is still remembered fondly here, and his namesake's arrival is cause for celebration. We've given Nickolay information on the whereabouts of those 16 skulls, which he's about to share with the elders of Bongu and Gorendu villages.
Have you heard of some of these ancestors' names before? Andan, Ibor, Kake, Panake?
Panake is from Komblum.
Panake from Gorendu. Okay.
I am ancestor of Peneki, and Peneki is a chief warrior. He's a fighter. I never know that the skull of my ancestor Peneki is at Sydney University in Australia.
Those 16 skulls from the Rai Coast, along with many others collected by the Russian explorer, ended up here at the University of Sydney in 1889. The University of Sydney declined to be interviewed for this story, but they said that they would review any requests for access or repatriation of the ancestral remains. This university is not alone. We reached out to historical institutions across Australia who confirmed that they still have Pacific Islander ancestral remains in their collections to this day. The Pacific made inquiries with Australia's 8 historic museums and discovered over 1,000 Pacific ancestors in their collections. The Australian Museum has the most, with nearly 400 ancestors, while the South Australian Museum, the National Museum of Australia, and Museums Victoria all have over 150. 5 of Australia's historic universities confirmed they hold Pacific remains, with nearly 300 at the University of Sydney.
A lot of these human remains either were just somewhat traded, and there were those that were just robbed and taken illegally, looting.
Teresi Vunidillo is a Fijian archaeologist who has worked with museums globally to repatriate ancestors. She says human remains were historically taken by pseudoscientists to justify racial inequality, and estimates there could be up to 100,000 Pacific ancestral remains in institutions around the world.
Because it all comes again to how you define a human remain or ancestral remain, because it's either you define it as a complete individual, it can also be identified as just the cranium or the skull or, the jawbone, teeth, the list goes on. A lot of international museums, they sometimes don't understand how we are so emotionally connected to these individuals. That kind of connection through spirituality, through our DNA, through our names, through our totems, it's something that continues forever.
Around the world, Western institutions have been trying to right the wrongs of the past. Australian museums have returned more than 2,700 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander remains. By comparison, repatriations from Australia to the Pacific rarely happen. Only 4 of the institutions we spoke to are working on Pacific repatriations.
I think it comes back to what purpose would those human remains do for those institutions today. If there's no use, maybe scientifically or educationally, for it to be taking space in the museum storage, then the right decision is for them to go back home. That's something I always encourage our museums in the Pacific, not to wait for Australian museums to come to them. It could go the other way as well.
But repatriation is often costly and complex. institutions lack resources, cultural understanding, and even details about the origin of the remains. And for descendant communities, it's an emotional minefield.
This has been a big shock to us.
South Sea Islander community leader Clacy Fatnauna was shocked to discover that the Queensland Museum was holding on to 65 ancestors' remains.
I think I would have really liked the Queensland Museum to reach out to us, and instead of the other way around. It's dragged us back to the 1880s with regards to how our people were treated. We need both the financial, the pastoral care and the mental health support to be able to work through this.
Securing government funding for Pacific repatriations is a challenge. A spokesperson for the Department of the Arts said the Australian government only provides funding for the return of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander remains.
Australian institutions holding foreign ancestors are responsible for their care and decisions about their repatriation.
The Queensland Museum said it welcomes repatriation and it called for a national policy.
Queensland Museum is committed to working with all levels of government to advocate and to support the development of nationally recognised policies and protocols for repatriation to Pacific Island nations.
It does seem a mammoth task. It's one that needs to be done. These institutions have to act ethically.
A big challenge for Pacific communities is deciding what to do with the remains. Descendant communities don't always agree. A protracted legal dispute has broken out between two parties of Banaban Islanders in Fiji over who are the rightful owners of a revered ancestor's remains stolen over 100 years ago, currently at the University of Melbourne.
The museum, I believe, should not be the final decision maker when it comes to that. They should be talking to village elders, they should be talking to community leaders so that they can come to a consensus.
The repatriation of two ancestors from the Australian Museum to Tonga in January has been viewed as a successful template for future repatriations.
Tongans, especially people from Ata, the Tongan Wur family, were able to inform how we could do this, and finding out how we can do this properly was part of the process, so that we can do that with the other ancestors we hold throughout the Pacific.
I know a lot of museums in Australia, they often asking for help in terms of knowledge or cultural protocols. These new relationships can be created, can be nurtured, can be strengthened.
Some have floated the idea of national resting places in Pacific Island countries for unidentifiable remains, something the Australian government is building in Canberra for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander remains.
Descendants can actually go there and pay their respects.
Back on the Rye coast, a heated discussion has broken out amongst the villagers.
6 of us, we have discussed and we all agree to bring back our skull to Perenduk for proper burial.
We feel very bad when we heard that our ancestors' skulls are in Sydney. As the Christian country, we want to get the skulls of our ancestors and bury them.
In a twist of fate, Nickolay Jr finds himself in a similar situation. After his burial, Nickolay Sr.'s skull was exhumed and it ended up in a St. Petersburg museum.
I believe that his skull has served the good science and humanity, and it is time to put it in the ground, to bury it.